We will be jumping right into our CC for the month. So it's on sustainable brewing. Our guest speaker is Bailey Spaulding, and she is the CEO and founder of Jackalope Brewing Company. So I'm going to stop sharing. Bailey, you can share your screen.
Okay.
So Bailey was born and raised in Montpelier, Vermont. She graduated from Harvard University in 2004 with a degree in biological anthropology before moving to Nashville to attend Vanderbilt Law School in 2006. There, she was editor-in-chief of the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review. It was in law school that Bailey discovered the world of homebrewing and set her sights on opening her own brewery. Upon graduating, she began working on Jackalope and opened the brewery in 2011. And after outgrowing the original facility, Jackalope opened a second location, also in Nashville, in 2018. When not at the brewery, Bailey spends her time with her husband, Luke, daughter, Zephyr, and spotty dog, Ricky. Bailey, whenever you are ready, you can take it away, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or hang on to them, and we will answer them at the end.
So you did make awesome. Well, thanks so much, Megan. And I really enjoyed getting to see more about what Harpeth is doing. I think that's so cool. As Megan said in the kind of bio for me, I started out at law school, and my interest was environmental law, and then decided I could be a brewer too, and do some good stuff for the environment too. So a little bit just about who Jackalope is before I kind of get into some sustainability and brewing things. Again, we opened in 2011 in Nashville as one of the first women-founded breweries in the country. Our original location was right on 8th Avenue, the kind of the corner of 8th and Division. Back in when we opened, the people were like, "Oh, by the methadone clinic," and now it's like in a very bustling part of town. We've since moved about 1.5 miles away to the Wedgwood, Houston neighborhood when we outgrew that spot. Our mission at the brewery, again, is much bigger than just kind of brewing beer. We want to create great beer, but also foster growth, fun, and constant improvement in the brewery and the community. And so that's where our sustainability focus has always tied in. It's always, okay, this is what we're doing, but what more could we be doing? We've grown significantly since we started a decade ago, but still about 85% of our beer is sold in Middle Tennessee. So we are really focused on this area in particular, and what we can do to just continue to be a positive part of our community. And one other Jackalope background thing, as far as like, why is this gal qualified to be talking to me right now? We're a founding member of the Tennessee Sustainable Spirits Program, which the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation started. I believe 2019 was the first year. And basically breweries, distilleries, and I would imagine wineries too, that kind of commit to these environmental standards and some kind of forward-looking practices can be a part of the Sustainable Spirits Program that is basically like like when you buy fish that has the Marine Stewardship Council kind of check mark on it, they're kind of hoping for it to have that similar effect, as far as giving people the feel goods that the product they're buying is committed to sustainable practices. Okay, let me see, slideshow, excellent. So the big thing, why water matters in brewing. So beer is about 95% water. I don't know, it's somewhat hard to talk into a computer, and you can't see people raise their hands about how much they know about brewing beer. But there are four essential ingredients in beer: water, malted grain, hops, and yeast. And water is the first one, and the one that people probably think about almost the most on the brewing side and probably the least on the consumer side, because you just kind of take it for granted. But it takes about 3 to 7 barrels of water to create 1 barrel of beer. A barrel is 31 gallons. It's 2 standard kegs. So when you think about that, Jackalope this year will probably make about 6,500 barrels of beer. Sam Adams this year will probably make about 2 million barrels of beer. So when you multiply that by 3 to 7, that really adds up as far as the water that's being used. Most urban breweries, like we are, get their water from their municipal water source, which is what we do, and then it is filtered for use. So here at Jackalope, we have a carbon filter and also a particle filter. Some breweries, depending on your water sources, will do RO filters, reverse osmosis filters, if they need something a little more intense than what we have. Nashville actually has pretty good beer, or pretty good pretty good water for brewing beer, as far as the pH and mineral content. Another thing with beer is, the pH, the mineral content, the contaminant content, all impact what your final beer is going to be like. So, hard water with lots of minerals versus soft water that really pretty much just has sodium as a mineral, create very different beers. So lagers, where in Eastern Europe, where lagers were kind of born out of Eastern Central Europe, they have very soft water. In England, where the ale style was really developed, they have very hard water. And so the styles kind of call for those different water types. And so generally what we'll do in a lot of the filtration is pulling stuff out and then adding things back in depending on the beer style. And so we'll add minerals into our ales that we won't necessarily add into the water content of our lagers that we do here. Another big one for urban breweries and big in Nashville is chlorine. Creates a really acrid, bitter, unpleasant flavor in your final beer. So you might not notice it when you're drinking a glass of water, but boy, will you notice it in your beer. So if anyone's home brewing, I really suggest filtering your water somehow, or going to a source where you can get distilled water, because that will color your entire experience and waste a month of your time if you don't start with really good water. And so a basic thing that we do, this is a picture of our brew house here. And so one thing that's really important, and I think probably most breweries should do at this point, is water reuse. And I actually can't speak for other breweries, but it's been really important to us from the start. And so basically, you've got your brew house, where here we've got our mash tun on the left, our boil kettle in the middle, and our whirlpool on the right. And then even to the right of that is that one really tall tank, which is our cold liquor tank. And behind that is a hot liquor tank, which is identical. Liquor in beer, or water, is called liquor in beer. So liquor equals water. It's not a giant, vodka tank or something. And so basically what we do, so in the brewing process, you are mixing grains with hot water, boiling it, adding hops, and then whirlpooling it to separate the vegetal material out, and then cooling it down to fermentation temperature, basically as fast as you can before kind of off flavors and weird funk can develop. So in that cooling process, we use water from the cold liquor tank, goes through a heat exchanger, cools down what at that point is called your wort, pre-fermented beer, and it's then piped into the hot liquor tank. And so not only does it get preheated, at that point. So there's much less energy needed to heat the water because it's already up in the hundreds. It's also saves it so that it's reused for your next brew. So the water that's used to cool one brew becomes the actual water in the next brew. And so we're able to save quite a bit of water that way. I hope that makes sense. I gesticulate a lot. So another big thing, and so we'll focus on water here, and I'll also talk about a couple of the other big places where breweries can focus on sustainability. The biggest waste product at a brewery is our spent grain. That is what is left behind after the mash, which is usually malted barley, but breweries also use wheat, oats, rye, corn, rice, all kinds of different things depending on the brew that you're making. At Jackalope, yeah, we'll use over 300,000 pounds of grain this year. And so typically what's left behind is low in carbohydrate because you've pulled all that out into your liquid, but high in protein. And so we donate that, instead of sending it to a landfill, we donate that to local farmers that use it for compost or for even feeding their animals. And the other thing with spent grain and basically just efficiency of your system is if you have your systems really dialed in, you'll have a very dry spent grain because you'll know exactly how much water you need to get what you want out of that grain and get into the boil kettle. And so here we have, I think, a 96% mash efficiency here, which ends up with very dry spent grain. And that's really what you're going for, because otherwise you end up with a lot of water that ends up going down the drain with it. Another thing to really focus on are ingredients. So these are actually hops in my hand here. And those are actually some that we grow at the Glenlevin farm owned by the Land Trust. We've had a relationship with the Land Trust since I was in law school, actually. And it was great when we were like, let's see if we can actually grow some hops at Glenlevin. So we have enough to do basically one brew a year. That's just kind of fun. And I ramble and divert sometimes, but with hops, see, they're kind of this like green leafy pine cone thing. And to use them fresh like this, you need to get them in the beer within 48 hours of being harvested, which is, doesn't work, 360 days a year. So generally by the time they're at a brewery, they've been dried and usually pelletized too. But so it's really fun to get to have this local place where we can grow our own hops and really connect to the agricultural side of our business, because I think people forget about that. And then, with the folks that we use to actually, really power our brews, I think it's just important to ask the questions of what are your farming practices, whether you're growing barley or growing hops. And we choose to work with farms that have their own environmental stewardship programs, and making it known that matters to us, and we're paying attention, and that is, that's helping their business. It helps solidify those efforts. And I think for grain, clearly a really big one too is also working with non-GMO grain farmers. They don't use any Roundup or related type things on their crops, and so you don't end up with really harmful runoff that is associated with using chemicals like that would then run off into the rivers and streams and get into the water supply and hurt the surrounding environment. So yeah. Another big thing for us, I really liked hearing Megan talk about all your community things that y'all are doing. That's a really big piece for us. On the left here, you're seeing some of the results of one of our Pick Up for a Pint days. We do those once a month. We're really excited. You know, we had to stop doing them for almost a year and a half, and with the pandemic, and we've restarted them. So the third Sunday of every month, we invite folks to come to the brewery, do basically pick up trash for an hour, and then we bring it back and we sort it into compost, recycle, or landfill. And then everyone who participates gets a free pint on us. So you get to drink beer and feel good about what you're doing. And, you know, we get to, you know, have a positive impact on the community. We also do work with nonprofits to do stream cleanups, invasive species removal. And then we have a program in our tap room that we work with really any, or a wide variety of nonprofits, but we associate a different beer every month to a different local nonprofit. So we should definitely talk to you guys about that, because we've worked clearly with the Land Trust, Cumberland River Compact, Urban Green Lab, Walden's Puddle, Friends of the Smokies, a lot of the kind of Tennessee nonprofits, and it's a great way that we try to, you know, raise money, but also awareness about some of the awesome work that people are doing, and try to educate our consumers who might be interested in helping out through, you know, activism or you know, donations. So that's a big piece of it. Getting kind of back into the production side of things. Packaging is also a really big source of waste, I think, in all products. And so trying to be really conscientious about that. This part's a little bit less about water, a little bit more about just sustainability in general. But in 2013, we became the first brewery in Nashville to can our beer. And our decision to can versus bottle at that time, people questioned, you know, now you know, tons of beers coming out in cans, and there isn't kind of this stigma about it that there was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. Speaking of, but part of it was definitely thinking about a large part of it was the environmental side of it, where, you know, aluminum cans are infinitely recyclable. As Megan mentioned, it is extremely hard to recycle glass in Nashville. And that's where almost all of our beer is sold. And so we knew if we went into bottles that it was not going to be getting recycled in general. There's less packaging required to protect the product because it's not breakable. And we also use PackTech handlers, which I wish I had one here. Looking around, I don't see one right in front of me, but they're different from, you know, the dolphin killers that are really a danger to wildlife and not recyclable, and just generally one of the poster childs for single-use plastic. So the PackTech handlers protect the top of your can. Oh, yay! Yay! He's got one. That's awesome. Jack's got one. And so Ryan's got one. And so, yeah, they're and they are also 100% recycled by the time they come to us, and totally recyclable and reusable. So it's just, again, thinking about just being conscientious about what you are what you are putting your beer in, and really trying to think about the little things that you can do that add up to a much bigger thing. Yeah. Ooh. Let's see. And our next, sorry, everything is falling around me. Our next and my last really main slide before you guys can just start asking questions is about CO2 recapture. And this is kind of something that is near and dear to my heart, and something that I would say 4 or 5 years ago, I started thinking about really seriously, which is that in the fermentation process, so after the brew, all that work goes into a fermenter, you add the yeast, it ferments, it creates alcohol, but it also creates carbon dioxide, CO2. And generally when you're brewing, all that CO2 goes out of a bucket into the environment, and then you purchase CO2, bulk manufactured CO2, for your downstream processes, whether it's carbonating your beer, purging air out of your kegs. Oxygen is the enemy of beer. It makes it go stale very quickly, and you don't want any O2 basically in any of your beer packaging, whether it's a keg or a can or anything else. And so it seemed very environmentally stupid and economically stupid that it's like, well, we're making all this CO2 and we're buying all this CO2. What? Like, where is the like, this is a nexus of stupidity. But really it's just that the technology wasn't there and is just starting. At that point in time, you had to be a much larger brewery to be able to have what was essentially a carbon recapturing plant at your facility. It was not in the game for breweries like us. And so in 2018, I met a woman named Amy George, who has a company called Earthly Labs, based out of Austin, Texas. And they were starting a CO2 recapture system for small breweries. And which is good, because I was like, how do I start this? And I had no freaking idea. So it was really helpful that someone else already had. And so she was starting this CO2 recapture system. She'd worked with a couple of breweries in Austin where they were, and I believe we became the third brewery in the country to actually put in one of these CC systems. And so, yeah, that's, you're looking at it right there. And so what it does is captures the CO2 coming off of our fermentations, cleans it, gets any impurities out of it. Once it has reached, the 99.99% CO2, it'll start to cool it and compress it and put it into that thing that says Carbomax there, on that, which is called a dewar. And ends up being the CO2 that we can use to power our carbonations and things like that. We do still need to purchase some CO2. It doesn't 100% power us, but that's what we're hoping to get to. I think a big thing with something like this is when you're on the front of a new technology, you really need to not get too down when it doesn't work perfectly, or what, if it's not 100% where you want to be, because I do, again, it's whether you care about the economics of it or the environmental side of it. It makes sense for everybody. So I do believe in 15 or so years, all the small breweries in the country are going to be recapturing their CO2, and they'll be like, oh yeah, remember when we used to not get that? And not to, I really appreciate the folks who we buy our CO2 from, not to sell them out, but when I first started talking about it, I talked to the woman who was our sales rep, and I was like, where does your CO2 even come from? And she was like, I've been doing this for 12 years and you're the first person to even ask me that. And it just was kind of like, it is the fifth ingredient in our beer in a lot of ways, but nobody thinks about, well, this has to come from somewhere too. So again, not to ramble on and on about it, but I really, I do love this kind of innovation that we've been able to be a part of. And it can, as it says on the CC on the screen, it can capture as much CO2 as 1,500 trees in a year. So you can really, try to envision you're in a forest of 1,500 trees while it's working, and feel good about being on the innovative side of technology for that. So yeah, that was my presentation. Thank you all so much. This is in Norway. I suggest anybody go there if they can. So if you, if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
So I would like to just jump in and just dominate this for like 1 second.
Excellent, Ryan.
And could you give us the elevator pitch or the like 1 minute talk about how you actually make beer? Because I mean, like I was telling you, I took my class.
Mm-hmm.
This was like 15 years ago, so I don't always remember the process. I know it involves yeast and barley and hops. But can you just give me the simple what goes into it?
I wish I could pick
step by step
computer up. I wish I could pick my computer up and walk it around to you guys.
Yeah. I mean,
I feel like I'd freeze.
Well, I wouldn't know that on a huge scale because I don't. They just seem like humongous tanks.
Sure. So I mentioned 4 essential ingredients: water, barley, or any malted grain, hops, and yeast. So starts with mixing hot water with your grain, your malted grain, to create the mash. Like when people talk about sour mash or something for whiskey, that's that point.
And that's where the sugar's coming from, right?
That is where the sugar's coming from. Exactly. So basically in the mash, you've cracked the grains open a little bit through a mill, and so to make those starches available. So basically you're mixing them with hot water that helps to pull out the starches and activate the enzymes that convert the starches to sugar.
Sure.
Because you want it to be, you're basically creating, well, I'll get to that later. So after your mash, you've basically got a liquid that's essentially a similar color to what your final beer is going to be, but it's very, very malty and sweet. And the more sugar there is in your sweet wort at that point, the more, generally speaking, the more alcohol there's going to be in your final beer. So if you're making a double IPA that's got a high ABV, it's going to have a bigger grain bill, more grain in it than a session or a Berliner Weiss or any of the kind of lighter beers. And so after your mash is done, you pump that sweet wort liquid into the brew kettle. The spent grain is sent out to your farmers to feed their animals and use for compost, and it's then boiled, and that's where you add your hops. Hops are a preservative, a natural preservative for your beer, so they keep your beer fresher longer. And as we know, they also provide a lot of aroma and and a lot of bitterness, depending on the hop and how you use it. Basically, the earlier you add it in the boil, the more bitterness it provides. The later and even after the boil that you put it in, the more aroma it provides. And there's lots and lots of different types of hops.
Sure.
And that's why every IPA is different. They're not all the same. After that, we whirlpool it, separate out all the hop vegetal material, cool it down, put it in the fermenter, add the yeast. The yeast creates the alcohol and the CO2, and that process for an ale, the fermentation process is generally about a week. To make an ale from start to finish is typically about 2 weeks. To make a lager from start to finish is generally more like 5 or 6 weeks.
Okay.
So lagers, because they use different yeast strains, their metabolic rate is a little bit slower, and then also the lagering process is basically after it's done fermenting, storing it at degrees for a number of weeks and just letting the yeast come out of solution. It just takes a little bit longer. And lagers, if you've ever had a lager that maybe didn't have quite enough time and they've got like, it's not skunky because skunky's from something else, but a kind of skunky flavor, that a very sulfuric flavor, I would say. That's from that lager yeast, and it just hasn't been given quite enough lagering time to get all that that out.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, there's a lot of natural flavors and aromas that happen during the fermentation process that if you don't give it the time it needs, will come out as an off flavor in your beer. And then you condition it, carbonate it either naturally or through CO2, keg it, can it, drink it off the tap, whatever. And ta-da, you have a beer.
Okay, well, I have like half a dozen more questions, but I'm gonna leave it open to see if anyone else would like to ask a question, because I don't want to dominate the question session.
Uh-oh. I don't know what I did.
So would anyone else like to ask a question? You can put it in chat. You can just unmute yourself and go for it.
Here, I'll stop sharing.
I have a couple of questions, Ryan.
Yeah, there you go, Jim.
Hey there, good evening. First off, as a class of 81 graduate of the law school, I want to know which class you skipped in order to learn home brewing.
Well, you know, when I graduated.
Civil procedure would have been one of my first choices, but anyway.
Oh gosh, yeah. I should have paid more attention in some of them, but I graduated 2009, and we actually started a Vanderbilt Law School brewing club when I was there, and it was me and about 20 guys, and I was the only one who actually learned how to brew beer.
The others were too busy sampling their wares.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it was good because I brewed beer and they'd all drink it, and so I had an audience,
Great. And I did have one serious question. When you think about your sustainable practices, your water recycling and recapture, your CO2 carbon, recycling and recapture, how much do you estimate that you save per year by having a really sustainable closed loop kind of system?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. We haven't monetized the water side of it, but I think that we probably, that's a good question. I don't know on the water side of it because we haven't done the economics on that. But on the CO2 side, it would probably be $15,000 a year.
Oh.
And so the equipment pays for itself over the course of a few years.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck, by the way. I love the product. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've had my share of it. Thank you.
Good, excellent.
Yeah, I want to say I love your work, first of all. And second of all, this may be more of like a philosophical question, but has it been difficult to like grow while also staying true to your sustainability practices? Or have you found that it's like relatively easy to just like grow while also like maintaining your operations in a sustainable way?
I do think you need a lot of buy-in from your staff, because if you're going to add, like with our CO2 recapture, it was like, this is why this matters. This, especially because we were one of the first ones to do it. So the technology was new and didn't always work the way you wanted it to. So you had to kind of get people who believed in what you were doing and why, and that you can trust to maintain it and keep it going. And I think a big part of that is trying to communicate as much as possible about like what the point is, and yeah, I mean, like Jim was saying, I was like, oh, I've never thought about actually communicating how much, you know, the water side, as far as actually trying to and capture what the full volume of water and you know, dollars is of that. And I think that would be helpful, you know, kind of showing people the why, I think, is important. And you know, luckily, yeah, you just kind of, we're lucky that it's been a part of our fabric since the start. And so it helps guide us when we're kind of at these growth inflection moments. So when we were building this new facility that's behind me, and we were getting all kinds of fun, shiny equipment, it was like, well, what is something that we can get that or do that isn't standard, or that can help kind of that we couldn't afford to do in the beginning. And I think that's really important too, that, you know, when if you're first starting and you don't necessarily have the capital to invest in something that will pay for itself over a number of years, but you know, you don't have that up front, there are little things that you can do along the way. You know, it's like we compost and we recycle, and you know, things like that, and these choices about your packaging. So there's smart choices that you can make while you're kind of growing towards something else. I think I've really might have rambled, but I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, yes, thank
okay,
you. Yeah,
good.
I love that.
Excellent, good.
Do you have any idea how many barrels you guys make a year?
Yeah, I think we'll do, you know, we've always grown until 2020. So pre-COVID, we were 65% draft beer or kegged beer that we sold at bars and restaurants or our facility. And so clearly that disappeared in March of 2020 for a significant amount of time. So in 2019, we did about 7,500 barrels. This year, we'll probably do about 6,500 barrels. And we are pretty much back at our 2019 volume numbers now. And so we're expecting 2022 to be our biggest year so far. And yeah.
I was just doing the math of how many gallons of water that takes.
It's a lot.
But for year 2019, if my math's correct, which it very well could not be because I suck at math, even though that was simple multiplication, it's 232,000 gallons of water.
200 final beer or
of water used.
Water, yeah. It's no joke. And so I think, you know, craft beer tends to be an industry with a lot of people who care about the environment, both on the production and the consumer side of things. And so you do have to, you know, be aware of the things that are not particularly great about it, and not pretend that they're not there. And so I think, you know, again, for us, you know, Kennedy's question about kind of growth and sustainability, you know, our focus has been on the CC and the CO2, and I think our next point probably is focusing more on kind of the wastewater side of things. There are some breweries. I'm from Vermont. There's some breweries up where I'm from that are starting to do some interesting wastewater treatment processes that I think, you know, again, they're expensive and take space and time, but that's definitely what we're looking at next, as far as where we want to go and keep improving, you know.
Well, one of the things that I was going to ask you, Bailey, and I'm not an expert in the water treatment process, but chlorine is generally a final treatment for tap water. So like you were mentioning that like too much chlorine, it like makes the beer bitter and can really like mess up the chemistry a little bit. Is that more or less universal, or is that a Nashville thing that like they add more chlorine here in Nashville?
compared to other places I've been, Nashville has a higher amount of chlorine.
Really?
I can't tell you why. Um, I don't know. I don't know why. But our carbon.
I was just saying, there's someone on the line that might be able
Yeah.
to tell you why.
It's just because it's coming from river water.
River
There you
water?
Surface water, it's the cheapest way to, it's not the best way, but it's the cheapest way.
Yeah.
And it's not hard. Our carbon filter pulls it out well. It's not hard to pull it out. It's just important to pull it out.
Yeah.
And so a perk of being on staff here is that big cold liquor tank we have is basically just 40-degree filtered delicious water, and there's a sample valve off the side, so we all fill our water bottles with really delicious water. We're well hydrated here.
Well, if it's what is it, reverse osmosis at this point? Like, are you all...
nearly, yeah. So it's pretty tasty.
All right, and one of the other things I wanted to ask you, and sorry for asking you too many questions. So you said that you buy a lot of your hops local. Do you buy any of your other ingredients local? And like, how do you like prioritize that?
Sure. So we grow a small amount of our hops locally. Most of our hops come from the Pacific Northwest.
Okay.
We do tend to buy all American hops, and a lot of hops in the world are grown in Europe and New Zealand, and we buy a very small amount of that, but I would say 98% of our hops are American.
Okay. But then you're like the grains and...
Yeah, so Tennessee is not friendly for beer ingredients, but basically anything we can get local, we do, because barley is not grown here much. It can be a winter crop, but generally Tennessee is too hot and humid for the things that go into beer. But we do, we'll do beers with local honey. We'll do beers with local herbs. We'll get stuff from Bloomsbury Farms. Truby honey. We've done stuff with vegetables from Delvin Farms before. So basically anything we can get locally, we do. There's just not a lot that you can get locally, and that is starting to change. There is a malt house in Tennessee now. They can't do the volume that we need for 300,000 pounds of grain for us for a year, but they do. We do a couple brews a year with their malt, and there are some hops folks in North Carolina, and so people are starting to figure out some growing practices that make those crops work here. A big thing with hops is extremely long days, and so that is hard to manufacture. That's hard to simulate, and just the heat and the humidity for a lot of hop varieties doesn't work well. So I'd say 85% of the hops in this country are grown in the Pacific Northwest. Some of the other northern states, Michigan, New York, Vermont, Maine, are starting to grow quite a bit as well. But yeah, I think for us, it's trying to work with places that have an environmental, if we can't get it local, we at least want to work with farms that are doing the right thing and have sustainability and stewardship programs of their own.
Well, I think that's totally fantastic, because I know one of the biggest things in like the food arena is just transportation. So, if you're buying hops from a different, from the other side of the world, then it's, I mean, like carbon footprint wise, it's just totally like unsustainable. Yeah. So
totally.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
And there's some very, very, very delicious hops grown in New Zealand, but typically we don't buy them here.
Is it worth it though? Is it worth it?
Exactly, because there's very, very, very delicious hops grown here too. So yeah.
Anybody else have any questions, comments?
Well, this is Dory. This is a nerdy question. Just because I was curious as to how the sewer plants in Nashville, or anybody in the state, do they consider breweries an industry? Do you have to do there's a whole thing they require if you're an industry source into a sewer plant?
we basically are monitored. So if you ever got to a point that your wastewater was a problem, you would be let known. And so, and I think probably different municipalities do it differently. I'm trying to remember, because I think it's a Nashville regulatory. I mean, I think it's through Metro Water. I think it's a Nashville regulatory system that we work with.
I didn't know. I mean, to me, I'm not sure the breweries are generally what they are concerned about. When you have a sewer permit for, and you have industrial users, industrial plants, it's been more about toxins and other things that they need to be removed at the plant. And so I was just thinking that for something like a brewery, it's more, it's not toxins, right? It's mostly
it's not toxins. It's more like bio. It's your bio load.
Feeding the bacteria in the sewer plant. Yeah, exactly. It's like, here's the food for the sewer plant right here. Here it comes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's they basically they test our wastewater and would basically let us know if we got to the point that we had an issue. But there again, that wastewater world is something that I'm interested in learning more about and seeing what we can do just to reduce the amount of water that we're using and sending down the drain.
Do you know how
And
often?
since you guys are the CO2 capture, are there others now picking it up in Nashville? Sorry, Megan.
You're good.
There are not others picking up on it in Nashville yet, but it's definitely where, 2.5 years ago, we were the third in the country. They have dozens and dozens of them out now. And so they're, again, in some parts of the country, part of this pandemic was a CO2 shortage. And so it made people realize, like, again, oh shit, this comes from somewhere. And so a lot of people started thinking about it. So in other parts of the country, it's definitely picking up a little bit faster than it is here. But, I do think in 15 years, it's just going to be what people do.
Why do you think that, because you mentioned that I think the water reuse, the CO2 reuse, and you mentioned you guys were one of the first in the state to do that. Why do you think other breweries aren't doing that stuff?
Because again, you have to invest in it. So
Sure.
You have to be willing to put the money down and hope that it actually does pay for itself. I think there's a lot of, just when you're doing work, I think there's a path of least resistance, and just the way things are always done. And so until you're like, oh crap, and it's something you notice every day, and it's like you walk past these bubbles coming out of your tanks that you're just like, ah. I think you might not even really notice it that much. A lot of breweries and again, I think the brewery industry is really great. I think a lot of breweries, I'm not going to sit here and be like, Jackalope is the best and nobody's doing anything, because I think a lot of breweries are probably doing some really great work and focusing on their own kind of points of innovation. And I think that's what's kind of important, and what hopefully the Sustainable Spirits program will kind of, again, help encourage. Again, it's like having that matter to people, having something that you can have printed on your cans, on your labels, that's like, hey, these folks are actually doing something. I think will be increasingly important.
So I'm going to steamroll Megan here real quick. So sorry, Megan, but we have about 1.5 minutes left, maybe, Bailey. And I wanted you to give us a little, where do you do cleanups? Where do you do invasive removals? Promote yourself. Yeah, give us how can we be involved with Jackalope?
Sure. Yeah. So I think following us on social media is the biggest way to kind of know what we're doing. Instagram and Twitter are just at Jackalope Brew. Our website is www.jackalopebrew.com. And you can sign up for our newsletter where you can learn about the beers we're putting out or some of these events that we're doing. And just come on by. We're on Houston Street in the Great Wedgwood, Houston neighborhood of Nashville. So come on by.
Go for it, Megan.
We have a question in the chat real quick. If people, yes. What do you do with the leftover from the beer processes? Is it thrown away?
Sure. So that was, so I talked about that a little bit earlier on. That is actually our spent grain is that big amount of waste there. And that's actually donated to farmers. They feed their animals and also feed their compost piles with it. And Cindy just asked me, what are you drinking? I'm drinking our Snowman Stout. And this actually, Ryan, this is an example of a local ingredient collaboration that my brain didn't even go to. This is our Mocha Stout, our Snowman. It's a seasonal that just came out and it'll run through the end of February. And it's brewed with Bongo, Java, coffee beans, and Olive and Sinclair cocoa nibs. So clearly the beans and the coffee and the cocoa come from somewhere else, but we work with local companies and roasters on that one. So it's very yummy.
All righty. Whoa. So I was gonna share my screen and say, follow us on social media, but that doesn't want to cooperate. So
it happens.
So thank you guys for joining us. It's 7 o'clock, so I don't want to keep you all longer than you need to be. Thank you so much, Bailey, for spending your Wednesday night with us and sharing all of this lovely information with us. If you guys have any questions or anything, reach out to my email. I think I emailed all of you guys individually that link for the Zoom. So you should have my email there, and I will be sending out a survey. So if you have any questions for Bailey, we will be able to get you in contact with her too. And you can leave us any and all feedback, please.
Thank you so much, Bailey. This was so interesting.
Thank you.
We need to do a cleanup soon.
Yes. Yeah, it would be, let's definitely do something together. I would love to.
That would be amazing.
We'll be in contact with you.
Cool. Excellent.
All right. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night, y'all.